There's a paradox that sits at the very heart of the human condition, one that Freud understood but spent most of his career being misunderstood about. The paradox is this: the more desperately you chase pleasure, the more it eludes you. And the moment you stop chasing it, when you finally surrender to simply being alive without the constant demand for excitement and satisfaction, something shifts. Peace arrives not as a reward for good behavior, but as a natural consequence of the cessation of struggle. This is not what people want to hear. In a culture obsessed with optimization, with hacking our happiness, with creating the perfect life through the perfect inputs, the suggestion that peace comes through stopping rather than starting, through surrendering rather than striving, feels like failure. But this is perhaps the most important insight from depth psychology, and it's one that has been so thoroughly distorted by popular self-help culture that most people don't even recognize it anymore. When people think of Freud, they think of a man obsessed with sex. They think of someone who reduced all of human psychology to sexual drives and childhood traumas. But this caricature misses something essential about what Freud was actually pointing toward. He wasn't saying that life is about maximizing pleasure. He was saying something far more sophisticated and far more useful. He was describing the pleasure principle and the reality principle and the eternal tension between them. The pleasure principle is what drives us in early life. It's the infant's demand for satisfaction. It's the part of us that wants what it wants immediately. Feed me now, hold me now, make me feel good now. There's nothing wrong with this principle. It's not evil or primitive or something to be ashamed of. It's simply the way the human organism begins. But here's what Freud understood. If you never move beyond the pleasure principle, if you spend your entire life operating from that place of constant craving and immediate gratification, you don't evolve. You suffer. The adult, the psychologically mature human being, is one who has developed what Freud called the reality principle. This is not the same as denying pleasure or becoming ascetic. It's the capacity to delay gratification, to recognize that some satisfactions are temporary and illusory, and to tolerate frustration without falling apart. The reality principle says, yes, I want pleasure, but I also recognize that I live in a world with other people, with consequences, with time. I can't always have what I want immediately, and that's not a tragedy. That's just life. But modern culture has fundamentally corrupted this understanding. We've created an entire civilization structured around the pursuit of pleasure. We've convinced ourselves that if we're not constantly experiencing satisfaction, sexual satisfaction, gustatory satisfaction, aesthetic satisfaction, achievement satisfaction, then something is wrong. We're broken. We need to be fixed, so we chase. We scroll endlessly through social media looking for the next dopamine hit. We jump from relationship to relationship looking for the perfect partner. We achieve one goal and immediately set our sights on the next one. We consume, we pursue, we strive, and we wonder why, beneath all of this accomplishment and satisfaction, there's an underlying current of anxiety and emptiness. Freud would tell you that this is because you're still operating from the pleasure principle. You haven't actually grown up psychologically. You're like an infant in an adult body, constantly demanding that reality conform to your desires. And here's the thing, reality never does. Reality is fundamentally frustrating. It's fundamentally disappointing. It's fundamentally finite. You're going to die. The things you love will change or be taken from you. The achievements that feel so important today will feel meaningless in 5 years. The relationships that consume you now will either end or transform into something different from what you imagined. These aren't pessimistic truths. They're just facts. And the person who can face these facts directly, without flinching, without constantly reaching for some distraction or pleasure or goal that will make them forget these facts, that person has access to something that the pleasure seeker will never have. That person has access to peace. Now, when I say peace, I don't mean happiness. I don't mean the absence of difficulty or sadness or challenge. I mean something deeper. I mean the peace that comes from no longer being at war with reality. The peace that comes from no longer fighting against the fundamental nature of existence. The peace that comes from accepting that you are a finite being in an infinite universe, that your time here is limited, and that this is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be inhabited. Think about what happens when you chase pleasure. There's a constant state of tension. You're always reaching for something that's slightly out of reach. You're always aware that what you have now won't be enough, that you need more, that you need better, that you need different. There's a perpetual sense of lack. Even when you achieve the goal, when you finally get the pleasure you were chasing, it lasts for a moment and then fades. The pleasure itself is not stable. It cannot be grasped and held. It's inherently transient. So you're forced to chase again, and again, and again, for your entire life. This is what the hedonic treadmill is really about. It's not just that people adapt to their circumstances, it's that the pleasure principle, by its very nature, cannot be satisfied because the satisfaction is never permanent. You feel the pleasure, and then you need more pleasure. You achieve the goal, and then you need a bigger goal. You get the partner, and then you start to notice their flaws. You buy the thing, and then you want the better version. There's no finishing point. There's no arrival. And because there's no arrival, because the goal is always receding into the future, you never actually exist in the present moment. You're always split between the now where you are and the future where you imagine you'll be satisfied. Your consciousness is constantly divided. Part of you is here, part of you is there chasing the next pleasure. This division of consciousness is itself a source of suffering. It's a kind of fundamental fragmentation of being. Freud recognized this in his work with neurotic patients. He saw people who were successful by every external measure, wealthy, accomplished, attractive, surrounded by people, and yet they were profoundly unhappy. They came to therapy seeking the secret to happiness, seeking some technique or insight that would finally make them feel okay. And what Freud discovered was that often their unhappiness was not because they weren't getting enough pleasure, it was because they were constantly chasing pleasure and terrified of stopping. The cessation of the chase is what terrifies people. Because if you stop chasing pleasure, if you stop filling your time with goals and achievements and acquisitions and experiences, what's left? You're left with yourself. You're left with the reality of your existence. You're left with the knowledge of your own mortality. You're left with the recognition that much of what you've spent your life pursuing has been a distraction from this fundamental reality. And that's not a comfortable place to be. So most people don't stop. They can't stop. The fear of facing themselves, of facing the emptiness that exists beneath the constant pursuit, is too great. They run faster. They chase harder. They add more goals, more relationships, more experiences to their calendar. They become addicted to productivity and achievement. They become addicted to romance and attraction. They become addicted to shopping and consuming. They become addicted to social media and the validation of likes and comments. All of these addictions have something in common. They're all ways of not being present to the actual reality of your life. And here's what's particularly insidious about modern culture. It has turned the pursuit of pleasure into a moral virtue. It tells you that you should be happy. It tells you that if you're not happy, you're failing at life. It tells you that the goal is maximum pleasure and minimum suffering. But this is the pleasure principle wearing a fancy outfit. This is infantile psychology dressed up as adult wisdom. Freud's insight was different. His insight was that psychological maturity is not about achieving happiness or maximizing pleasure. It's about developing the capacity to live with reality as it actually is. It's about what he called sublimation, the channeling of the fundamental drives and energies into pursuits that are productive and meaningful. It's about being able to experience pain and frustration and disappointment without falling apart. It's about having a stable sense of self that doesn't depend on external validation or constant new experiences. When you achieve this, and I'm not saying it's easy, it's actually one of the hardest things a human being can do. When you achieve this capacity to be present to your life as it is, without constantly demanding that it be different, that's when peace finds you. Not because you've achieved all your goals, not because you've finally gotten the perfect partner, or the perfect job, or the perfect body, but because you've stopped the constant internal struggle. You've stopped fighting reality. You've stopped demanding that your life be something other than what it is. Think about the people you know who seem genuinely at peace. They're usually not the ones chasing the most pleasure. They're usually the ones who have cultivated a certain acceptance of their limitations. They're the ones who can sit alone without needing to be entertained. They're the ones who have deep relationships not based on constant novelty and excitement, but on genuine connection and mutual growth. They're the ones who have meaningful work that they value, not because it brings status or wealth, but because it's an expression of who they are. They're the ones who have faced their own mortality and their own limitations and have not been destroyed by this knowledge. This is what Freud meant when he wrote about the death drive. People often misunderstand this concept. They think it means a literal drive toward death, some kind of suicidal impulse. But it's more subtle than that. The death drive is the recognition that we are finite beings, that entropy is real, that all things end, including us. And the person who can integrate this knowledge, who can accept it without constantly trying to outrun it through the pursuit of pleasure and novelty, that person has access to a kind of peace that the pleasure seeker will never have. Because here's the thing, the more you chase pleasure, the more you're running from this fundamental reality. The more frantically you pursue happiness and satisfaction, the more you're trying to convince yourself that you're not going to die, that your time here is infinite, that there's always more, that you'll eventually arrive at some permanent state of satisfaction. But you won't. None of that is true. And the energy you spend running from this truth is energy that could be spent actually living your life. When you stop the chase, when you sit down and you simply exist, when you allow yourself to feel bored or sad or frustrated or uncertain without immediately reaching for a distraction, something shifts. The tension decreases. The constant internal demand quiets down. You become more present to what's actually happening in your life right now, in this moment. You start to notice things you've been too busy to see. You start to appreciate things you've been taking for granted. You start to have deeper connections with people because you're actually present with them, rather than half present and half mentally reaching toward the next thing. And from this place of presence, from this place of acceptance, genuine pleasure becomes possible. But it's a different kind of pleasure. It's not the frantic, desperate grasping for stimulation that characterizes the pleasure principle. It's a quieter, more stable satisfaction that comes from engagement with life as it actually is. The pleasure of a conversation that really connects. The pleasure of work that feels meaningful. The pleasure of a body that's simply functioning and not demanding constant pampering or optimization. The pleasure of a meal that's enjoyed rather than consumed for status or validation. The pleasure of being alone without needing to be distracted. Freud understood that the unconscious mind operates largely through the pleasure principle. The unconscious wants what it wants, and it wants it now. It doesn't care about consequences or reality or other people. It just craves and hungers and demands. The work of consciousness, the work of becoming an adult psychologically, is to develop the capacity to observe these demands without automatically acting on them, to see the craving arise and to choose not to follow it, to recognize the impulse and to understand it without being controlled by it. This is what meditation practices have always been pointing toward, even though they are often misunderstood in modern contexts. Meditation is not about achieving peace or happiness or special states of consciousness. It's about developing the capacity to observe the mind without being controlled by it. It's about watching the cravings arise without following them. It's about watching the thoughts appear and disappear without attaching your identity to them. And in this practice of non-attachment, in this capacity to observe without grasping, peace naturally emerges. But modern culture has turned meditation into just another pursuit. It's packaged and sold as a technique for happiness optimization. You meditate to feel better. You meditate to be more productive. You meditate to access special states of consciousness. In this way, meditation becomes just another form of the pleasure principle. You're still chasing something. You're still demanding that your inner experience be different from what it is. You're still operating from lack. The real practice, the practice that Freud was pointing toward in his work, is the acceptance of things as they are. It's the development of what we might call psychological resilience, the capacity to face difficulty without falling apart, to face limitation without going into despair, to face mortality without needing to distract yourself from it constantly. And this resilience, this capacity to be present to reality, is the foundation upon which genuine peace rests. Here's what happens in a typical person's life. In childhood, you're operating purely from the pleasure principle. You cry when you're unhappy, you laugh when you're happy, you want what you want. As you grow up, you're gradually socialized into the reality principle. You learn that you can't always have what you want. You learn delayed gratification. You learn consideration of others. This is healthy development. But then something goes wrong in modern culture. Somewhere along the way, instead of continuing this development towards psychological maturity and the capacity to live with reality, we get stuck. We spend our entire lives trying to recreate the pleasure of childhood. We're looking for partners who will make us feel unconditionally loved, like a child feels with a perfect mother. We're looking for achievements that will make us feel safe and worthy like we felt as children when praised by our parents. We're looking for experiences and purchases that will make us feel that sense of wonder and excitement we felt as children. But we can never recreate this. We're not children anymore. And even if we could recreate it, it would be a betrayal of our potential as adults. The work of adulthood is not to return to childhood states of consciousness. It's to develop into something more mature, more integrated, more capable of facing reality directly. Freud called this process individuation. It's the process of becoming yourself, of becoming conscious of your own patterns and limitations and possibilities. And this process necessarily involves some discomfort. It involves confronting aspects of yourself you'd rather not see. It involves giving up fantasies about how life should be and accepting how life actually is. It involves recognizing that much of what you thought was important is actually trivial, and what you thought was trivial is actually profound. When you go through this process, when you do the real work of psychological development, something remarkable happens. The constant inner tension decreases. The desperate grasping for pleasure becomes less intense. You start to feel more grounded, more solid, more capable of just being alive without constantly demanding that life be different. And this is when peace finds you, not as a reward, not as a goal you've achieved through the right technique or the right practice, but as a natural consequence of no longer being at war with reality, as a natural consequence of having integrated the reality principle into your being, as a natural consequence of accepting limitation and mortality and impermanence, and still choosing to be fully alive within those constraints. This is what Freud meant when he said that when you stop chasing pleasure, peace finds you. It's not a mystical statement, it's a psychological principle. It's an observation about how the human mind actually works. The more energy you expend chasing pleasure, the less energy you have available for actually being present. The moment you stop that chase, that energy becomes available. And with that energy, with that attention, with that capacity to be truly present, peace becomes possible. The question is whether you're willing to stop chasing, whether you're willing to face the discomfort of simply being alive without constantly reaching for the next distraction, whether you're willing to feel bored or sad or uncertain without immediately trying to fix it or escape it, whether you're willing to sit with yourself and really see what's there beneath all the accomplishments and the acquisitions and the experiences, because that's where the peace is. Not in the pursuit, not in the achievement, but in the acceptance, in the presence, in the integration of the reality principle into the core of your being. That's where peace finds you. When you finally stop running and turn to face what you've been running from all along, the rest of your life awaits that moment. The question is, are you ready to stop?